Ultrasound is essentially directional in nature. This directional property provides a new vision of waves in fluids. These waves have localized effects. Furthermore, a fluid whose particles have an angular momentum can perfectly be envisaged. Such a momentum can only be transmitted transversely. Waves in such a fluid thus have a transverse property. The waves in fluids have a duality and a transversally, which finally opens up the possibility of an ether. Waves in all fluids have effects that can be localized on limited surfaces. All these waves are essentially directional. The amplitude of a tsunami remains maximum in its direction of propagation over hundreds of kilometers. In the air, the directional power of musical instruments was studied in the 1960s in order to optimize the position of musicians. Sound in the air is more directional as the frequency is higher. We now know how to produce ultradirectional sound waves. You must position yourself in line with the speaker equipped with peripheral ultrasonic emitters to hear the voice or music. Ultrasound thus has localized effects. It can be assumed that space is filled with a fluid composed of particles much smaller than all known particles, the ether. If the particles of the ether are very regular spheres, the waves in the ether practically do not disperse. They can therefore maintain their transverse dimension over very large distances. Thus the oscillation of an electron in such a fluid produces two symmetrical trains of waves whose transverse surface doesn't exceed that of the electron. We can therefore think that such a train of waves have effects similar to a corpuscle by colliding with and expelling an electron, as in the photoelectric effect. The speed of sound in the air has a very simple explanation. The molecules of the air are in constant agitation, colliding with each other. The waves in the air at a regularly fluctuating speed. A fairly simple calculation shows that the speed of waves in the air is the square mean of the agitation speeds of the molecules in the fluid. The speed of light could be explained in exactly the same way. The speed of light is the square mean of the agitation speeds of the particles of the ether. Ether waves can be dispersed by passing through a fairly narrow slit. The dispersed wave can then split in 2 by 2 parallel slits and produce interference on a screen exactly as happens in air. We also obtain interference with electrons, carbon-60 molecules, and even with large organic molecules. Unlike the waves generated here in water, these electrons and molecules move at very low speeds compared to the speed of light. As a result, the waves they form as they move through the ether precede them. They interfere and cause a distribution of these elements in the space located after the slits. Areas of high pressure push electrons, atoms, and molecules toward low pressures that remain aligned in the direction of the bands that form on the receiving device. When two particles of the ether collide, the momentum is transmitted according to the laws of Descartes. This transmission occurs by elastic deformation of the particles. Flattening the contacting parts of the particles prevents the particles from sliding over each other. This flattening allows for transmitting their angular momentum when colliding. A train of ether waves produced by the oscillation of an electron will be characterized by an alternating momentum transmitted to the ether particles. The particles will also transmit the angular momentum coming from the angular momentum of the electron. The angular moments are transmitted transversely. Ether wave trains propagate longitudinally, but they have a transverse property, polarization linked to the angular momentum of the ether particles. The oscillations of the electrons cause the formation of two symmetrical wave trains. The orientation of the polarization is directly linked to the orientation of the angular momentum of the emitting electron. The polarization angles of the two wave trains are therefore identical and are defined upon emission. If no external action comes to modify this angle, it remains unchanged whatever the distance traveled by the wave trains. The two wave trains are entangled from the very moment of emission. The wave trains of the ether essentially result from the oscillations of electrons. But there is nothing to confirm that these wave trains are electromagnetic in themselves. In the same way, the vibration of a piano string causes trains of waves in the air. These waves in the air are pressure waves. We talk about sound waves, but in reality they are only sound to our ear. And conversely, a train of waves from the ether can make an electron oscillate exactly as a pressure wave in the air makes the membrane of the microphone vibrate. However, the oscillations of the electrons are alternating currents in the conductors. This is exactly what happens in Hertz's experiment. Miller's measurements with a Michelson interferometer and Professor Allais' statistics showed that Michelson's experiment gives deviations linked to the respective positions of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun. A solution to these discrepancies is to take up Descartes whirlwinds. Since the Earth is dragged by the Sun's whirlwinds, Michelson's experiment could not highlight the Earth's rotation around the Sun. It is unthinkable that Michelson's experiment has not yet been carried out in space. In a satellite rotating around the Sun in the opposite direction to the Earth, this interferometer should record a speed of 60 km per second. For Descartes, the stars are surrounded by whirlwinds. However, for a whirlwind to form, Hamilton's principle requires the presence of condensation. Descartes' whirlwinds therefore have a cause, the condensation of his medium of space in the stars. Today we would say that the ether is condensing into matter. The whirlwind of the Sun causes the planets to rotate. The tangential speed of this whirlwind must therefore be proportional to the inverse of the square root of the distance from the Sun. Unfortunately, these whirlwinds in perfect fluids have a tangential speed proportional to the inverse of the distance from the center of the well. This result is taken from the Lagrange equation, the energy equation. But then, there is a solution. If the particles in the ether are animated not only by linear Brownian motion, but also by angular momentum, then the principle of equipartition of energy exactly doubles the energy term in the Lagrange equation, whose solution is then very exactly a tangential speed proportional to the inverse of the square root of the distance to the center of the well. The law of condensation fluxes in all fluids is 1 over r squared. On the other hand, the condensation flux and the drag of the ether are both proportional to the outer surface of the atomic nuclei. For them to be proportional to their mass, the nuclei need only be bubbles and not solid balls. This is Newton's law. The condensation of ether in matter is the cause of gravity. But these bubbles would also have to be the same thickness for all the atoms. This is not exactly the case. The thickness varies very slightly. This explains the mass defect, which is of the order of magnitude of 10 to the minus 24 grams. In application of Poincaré's theorem, the whirlwind concentrates in a plane, which is the equatorial plane of stars and planets and the main plane of galaxies. On each side of this equatorial whirlwind, the ether also condenses, so that whirlwinds must appear, and so on up to the poles. The zones thus formed are separated by vortex cones, giving the zones alternating inverse rotations. This explains the zonal appearance of the planets. The ether causes the gases surrounding the planets to rotate. This is the case for Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. The zones formed by these gases themselves form gas vortices through friction at their interfaces, as can be seen up to the pole of Jupiter. Earth's ocean currents also have a distinctly zonal nature. The phenomenon is also indisputable for terrestrial winds, although it is less obvious. The rotation of the Sun on itself is essentially zonal. The inclinations of comet trajectories, relative to the equatorial plane of the Sun, have a zonal distribution. Retrograde comets are in the gaps in this distribution. The solar system has a zonal characteristic. The stars of the galaxies are concentrated in their main plane. If the ether condenses in matter, the nuclei of the atoms must therefore gradually grow. The light that reaches us, from very distant galaxies, was emitted billions of years earlier. At that time the nuclei were smaller, and therefore emitted red-shifted light, compared to the emission of the same atoms today on Earth. All stars must grow, but if their density is greater in the interior than at the surface, the central part will grow faster than the periphery, which will be stretched. The Earth's crust, in particular, stretches mainly in the thinnest areas, at the bottom of the oceans. In addition, magma eruptions regularly lower the Earth's internal pressure. This explains the volcanoes, earthquakes, and large mountain ranges that have sprung up from the depths of ancient seas. The application of Hamilton's principles, and the conservation of angular momentum, also makes it possible to verify that the speed of stars does not depend on the distance from the eye of their galaxy. In water and air, the angular kinetic energy of the whirlwinds is exactly equal to the angular kinetic energy of the fluid particles. In the ether, on the other hand, the angular kinetic energy of the whirlwinds is twice that of the ether particles. Compensation is achieved by absorbing the angular kinetic energy of the ether particles until it is cancelled out when the law of tangential velocities returns to 1 on r. During absorption, the tangential velocity law of the whirlwinds of galaxies changes from 1 on the root of r to 1 on r according to the red curve. The velocity varies little in this zone. Similarly, close to the Sun, where the speed of rotation is very high, the law of tangential velocities is no longer exactly the inverse of the square root of the distance. This is the case for the planets Mercury and Venus. As in atmospheric cyclones and whirlpools in water, the tangential velocity of the ether near the eye of the galaxy can be so high that a calm zone is formed, devoid of matter and therefore emitting no light, a black hole. The equations of fluid mechanics with angular momentum are given in the book Fluid Mechanics and Physics.